Welcome to Round Hill Radio. Through our conversations, we discover the holy and the ordinary, look for moments of grace and peace, and redefine what we're talking about. We talk about faith. Hey, Ed.
How you doing, Leslie?
I'm good. And before we get started, a little announcement. I have my announcement hands on the table.
Is it the big announcement?
The big announcement is that if you are a local-ish person, we would love to invite you here to Round Hill Community Church on Sunday morning, May 10th, because we are doing a special live episode of Round Hill Radio because this is our 250th episode.
Yay. Amazing.
Amazing. It only took us 9 years, which feels actually kind of slow.
Go at your own pace.
But also 250 feels like a giant number. So I'm kind of caught between those two expressions of that. But May 10th at 10, which also happens to be Mother's Day. So we'll probably use that as rich topical ground.
Yes. Yes.
But we are going to be the Sunday worship experience instead of a traditional sermon. We're going to be doing kind of a hybrid like podcast, maybe a little Ask Ed, maybe a little community involvement. So it's going to be really fun, a fun celebration.
I love it.
I'm stoked.
We'll bring some ideas, some starters.
Yeah.
To get the conversation going, but it seems like a perfect day to be doing that.
I think it's going to be really fun.
Celebrations.
Yeah.
All the way around.
So the fun idea too is if you are a video watcher of the podcast, I'm going to bring this table and the gadgets upstairs. We're going to kind of like recreate it in a little bit. I think it's going to be fun.
It's going to be a blast.
It's going to be a blast. So please join us May 10th, 10 a.m. If you're local, it's going to be a blast. Otherwise, you will see a video of it and of course the audio wherever you get your favorite podcasts like this one. So that will be up within that next probably week or so.
Fantastic.
We're excited. What are we talking about today?
So
a
couple of words have bubbled to the surface. Sometimes it's good to pay attention, right? To things that are like
wiggling at
tugging
you.
at our tugging at our elbows, right? So the word urgency was one of those words. The word obsession was one of those words because sometimes we come across people, maybe it's especially in the arts or sciences or, who are totally obsessed with their work. They feel a high level of urgency about it. And it can make some of us feel like, I'm sort of lagging behind a little here.
Yeah.
But, I think there are parts of everyone's life where urgency has to be honored.
Okay.
Right? Or where we have to be obsessed about something in order to get it done.
Yeah.
Or where there's a health issue or whatever that may be. So since we were talking about these words, it did make me think of that phrase that Jesus says at the beginning of his ministry, seek first the kingdom of God.
Okay.
This is his program for the future. And interestingly enough, I saw a little clip from a British scholar whose name is, it's N.T. Wright is how he's known. He's from within the Church of England, prolific writer. But he said for some reason, Christianity has evolved in many circles as the place you go to when you're trying to figure out how to get life after life. It's all about salvation. It's about getting into heaven. So that's a very powerful strand. But he said, that's not Jesus' program. Jesus' program is seek first the kingdom of God.
Okay.
It's making that reality present on earth. What does the world look like, as one person said, when God's in charge? And how do we bring that into fruition? Because apparently God just won't do that with an edict, but has to do it through us. So in order for that to happen, would seem like there needs to be some urgency.
Okay.
And it would seem like that's something that we might well be obsessed with in a good sense.
Yeah.
So that's how I'm thinking about these words. I'm thinking about this theme. And I did mention to you that I followed this online tennis teacher, full transparency.
You're allowed to do that.
Who describes himself as your fully obsessed online tennis teacher. Not just any online tennis, but fully obsessed. And I'm like, I like that. I like that spirit.
You like people that are passionate about something.
Yeah. There's we become a little concerned when there's emotional flatness, right? Where it seems like there ought to be some hills and valleys, going on, but instead we get this affect that, does anybody really care about this?
Yeah.
By the way, I had a couple of Zoom meetings recently where this was, very much the case, where it was just very
Flat.
the energy was super low, and hard to tell why that was the case, but it can happen, right?
Totally.
So anyway, we hope it's not happening where we're seeking first the kingdom of God. So anyway, I'm kicking the can down the road to say, what are we thinking about this?
I think that's really interesting because the urgency thing, I will say, came from me as we were walking down the hall to the studio here, because I've been thinking about, I was listening to another podcast earlier, Jefferson Fisher, if you like that. He talks about, he's big on like communication
Okay.
and how to approach difficult topics with those you love and how to communicate better, get your point across better. Very helpful, especially for somebody like me who goes blah, 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 blah. So I was listening to his podcast and he was talking about, he had a professor on and he was talking about urgency versus importance and that idea. I mean, it wasn't like the core idea, but they mentioned it, that it's sort of this idea that seems to kind of keep coming back around within popular culture of like, what is urgent and then what's important and then what is both things.
Right.
And that
Yep.
the urgent tends to get in the way of the important. And that is interesting. And so I was just...
And it has always felt to me like it's an ongoing process of figuring out whether the urgent thing is urgent because it really needs to be there, or it's just somebody's urgent voice that won't be denied. Maybe it's actually not the most important thing,
Right. Like that's not my emergency.
but it's the squeaky wheel that becomes urgent and occupies. So part of it is figuring out, okay, there's urgency. I sense urgency in this person, but is it urgency that really has to be paid attention to right now? Or is it driven by some other kind of need,
That's interesting.
right?
Yeah.
And so if I could shift it over to the word obsession for a second.
Do.
One of the things I think that has happened in churches over the last half century is that many times we'll find that in local congregations, people can be obsessed about a program, a tradition, a practice, without evaluating whether or not that obsession is worthy of any more attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe its life usefulness was in fact worn out a long time ago.
Yeah.
But we keep the tradition alive at all costs, maybe because we feel it's a way of honoring those who've gone before us. You know, someone might say, I remember when I was such and that group always did this, and now I'm going to do it as a way of honoring them and keeping that tradition going, without really evaluating whether it's worthy of an obsession.
I have a language question for you.
Yes.
What would you say the difference is in this context with which we are framing things between a passion and an obsession?
I think my guess at this
Yeah. I mean, it's what you think.
is that the obsession is what the passion looks like when it's given practice.
I like that.
Longevity,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because a passion could arise and it may be a very important, there may be something at its core that's really worthy of attention, but then maybe there's, for those of us who suffer from shiny object syndrome,
I don't know who you're talking about.
just saying,
Ooh,
it
squirrel.
happens. It happens.
So a problem.
There's another passion over there.
Yeah. Ooh.
There, what do you know? There's a whole bunch of them around. So the obsession is, now I'm going to take that passion and I'm going to stay with it.
Yeah.
You know, and usually if you do that, the thing about that is that, you know, obsessions tend to be quite consuming.
Yeah.
And I think the biblical word for an obsession is zeal. Zeal.
Oh, yeah.
So if someone is zealous, there's a kind of continuity that's implied.
Yeah.
And that person is going to stay the course.
Yeah.
And I think of that with obsession. You know, the person's going to find every single way, or the group or the team or the church, every single way to get something done. Hopefully, that's worth doing. That's how I would distinguish them. Does that make sense?
Totally. I just think it's interesting. I wouldn't have thought about it that way. I like that a lot.
It's a great question. And, you know, in fact, it occurs to me.
Love it.
I think that sometimes, you know, I've heard people say of individuals sometimes related to a cause, I don't sense much passion there. However, it may be that the obsession runs quietly.
Yeah.
So the passion doesn't demonstrate itself as being
Enthusiasm.
right.
Yeah.
There's no maybe there's not emotional intensity, but maybe there's a quiet steadiness, and that can be indicative of obsessiveness in a good way, in a way that's leading towards, let's say, whatever Jesus means by this kingdom of God.
Nice.
So I think part of what congregations, urgency now, back to urgency.
Love it.
The urgency for congregations is actually to create a welcoming space for passions that lead to obsessions, that grow congregations for the betterment of the world.
Which is where the seeking comes in.
Right. Seek that.
Seek that. That we're making sure that when we are seeking, we're pointed in the right direction.
Right.
Got it.
Right. And that phrase, kingdom of God, it's a little unfortunate in the sense that I don't know that it translates well from one age to another.
Sure.
Kingdom tends to mean a political entity. It's got boundaries. That there's a king. You know, there's a hierarchy and all of those things. It's hard to tell whether Jesus is using that phrase in a subversive sense. So if he says kingdom of God, you know that he's not talking about kingdom of Caesar.
Got it.
Right? So that's sort of shorthand for, you know, a way of talking about upsetting the apple cart without literally talking about upsetting the apple
Right.
cart.
It's talking about sort of uplifting and focusing on the divine and seeking the divine instead of seeking Caesar or seeking this, you know, worldly leader.
And I think if people say, well, what is this kingdom of God, you know,
sorry.
all good. What is this kingdom of God actually all about? I think Jesus would probably say, well, watch me. Because that's what we're going to do.
Yeah.
We're going to start practicing what life looks like when the kingdom of God has arisen to a state where it's occupying our energies and our priorities and our faithfulness.
Okay.
So I think that's what's intriguing. If you read through, so we have these 4 portraits of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's interesting to read through the filter of their eyes what they think the kingdom is all about as they understand it from Jesus' perspective, keeping in mind some of them are writing about 100 years after he died.
Right.
So they have to really search back, you know, into those stories to try to pull that up into the future.
What feels like an example of the kingdom of God for you now? In terms of like, what do you feel like we need more of, or what do you feel like you see that reflects that? I'm giving you options for your answer here.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You know, I was talking actually with a group of colleagues this morning, and the 2 facets of life at Round Hill Community Church that I think are most reflective of that are the commitment to creating a environment that's carbon free, right? That's not relying on fossil fuels, that's green, that's helping out the earth, that's a gift to future generations. That feels kingdom related to me. I think the work we've been doing with Afghan evacuees is the same way, because there's such a strong thread of welcoming the immigrant and the refugee all the way through the Old Testament into the New. That feels like kingdom work. You know, hospitality to fragile or vulnerable strangers is very, very close to the heart of what Jesus demonstrated in his life, right? Where he offered that hospitality himself. So those are definitely 2 things that I see.
I think that's fantastic. I mean, both of those things have felt, this feels like an understatement of the century, but unique in this in this place, in this sort of climate. I think they feel courageous in a way that I find interesting, and I think it's an exciting opportunity that we have as a community, and the fact that we've very much put our money where our mouths are. That it's an action. Do you see opportunities moving into the future that could be similar, or?
I do. I think one of the things that happens when congregations start to grow, one of the sort of unexpected blessings, is that people will bring ideas you can't even imagine now. That's fun.
That's beautiful.
And so who knows how that's going to happen? That's part of being curious about the future.
Yeah.
And waiting for those good surprises.
I think that's actually part of what I call like small church magic.
I love that.
Because I love me a small church. I really do. And that's the really cool thing, because for longtime podcast listeners, this, but if you're new around here, I was raised in a very, very, very large church. Now you would call it a mega church. It wasn't back then. It was actually traditional worship, but it happened to have 13,000 members. So, hi, I'm weird. But so there's a point to this, but in that setting, you can feel a little bit lost.
Yeah.
You can feel a little bit anonymous. And I love here that I know almost everybody's name.
Yeah.
And if I not, it's my fault and not theirs, because I have a terrible memory, and thank goodness for name tags. But at the same time, it's like you're the opposite of anonymous, and you feel seen and loved and welcomed, and your input is so deeply valued, and your ideas are so deeply valued the second you walk in the door. And I think that is such an incredible example of community.
Yeah.
And I think that's, at least for me, as we're coming out of COVID, if we've come out of COVID and like everything felt so distanced and all awful, that like a community like this feels so healing to like a part of me that really struggled during COVID.
Yep.
Like I really had a hard time. And so I think that idea that you can bring your idea for what the kingdom of God on earth looks like, and that a place like this will be like, well, isn't that a great idea? Let's find some friends who you can do that with, and let's go be a force for good with God together.
I love that.
I would like a gold star for that tie-in, please.
You got it. You get 2 of them.
Oh, thanks. Yay. But I think jokes aside, I think it's genuinely beautiful.
Yeah, I love the way you've described that. I'm thinking about some of the things that we do on Sundays, like last Sunday, intergenerational worship, where our associate pastor Lillian could say, "Look, today we've created prayer stations for you."
It was so fun.
And go off and create. If you don't, Leslie's going to play music in the back, or something's going to happen,
Yeah,
right? And but it is not easy to do that in many settings.
No.
It's impossible to do it in some settings. You just wouldn't have the room to be able to manage. And I think that we really need to think carefully about going forward. Talk about being obsessed. Being obsessed not with numerical growth, but rather obsessed with a certain kind of community quality, and saying that's what we do not want to lose. And should we grow to a point where we think that that's going to be compromised, we're going to have to think about how to organize ourselves so we don't lose that.
Yeah.
Because that's really at the heart of it. And it's so funny. Years ago, I had a wonderful professor in seminary, Bob Seaver, became a very good friend. And sometimes we would talk about, quote unquote, large churches, especially in New York City, right?
Sure.
Large churches. And sometimes students would lament a little bit. They'd say, look at these churches. They're huge. They can do anything. They've got on and so on.
Yeah.
Bob sometimes would say, sometimes that's window dressing.
Oh, interesting.
So that what looks like, it's creative or it's energized. I'm not saying that it isn't or can't be. But when you think about the work that's been done by scholars to understand how Christianity grew in its first 300 years. And there's a man named Rodney Stark, who's a sociologist, whose books are really, really beautifully written about this topic. It wasn't because there were any large churches.
They were like in houses,
They were in houses.
right?
And their
Living rooms.
basically their vision was that they were the most compassionate people on the planet. That's what they wanted to be. That was their understanding of the kingdom of God. That's what obsessed them. And Stark says actually that there were comments made at the time that when plagues would strike various regions of the Roman Empire, as they often did, if you had enough resources, you could escape into a mountaintop villa and go up into the higher ground and get fresher air and get away. Christians, even if they could have done that, did not, because they wanted to be available to those who were hurting and dying. So people saw that and said, I want to be part of that. That looks courageous and that looks compassionate. And that's really how Christianity grew over that period of time. So I think that's something that's worth being obsessed about. Compassion.
Courageous compassion.
Courageous compassion. How do we demonstrate that? Think about it, wonder about it. You know, there's so much richness there.
I think I've decided that courageous compassion is the new radical hospitality. Courageous compassion. Well, now I know what to title the podcast episode.
Right?
That's beautiful.
There it is.
That's going to stick for a
You-
while.
you
I
dubbed
like
it.
that.
Yeah. Yep. And
That's cool.
I think that
If we can aim to be anything, if we seek to be anything, it's to be courageously compassionate, isn't it?
there's the urgency,
Yeah.
there's the obsession,
There's this.
there's the longevity,
There's the direction.
all of it.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for that, Ed.
Thank you for that.
Thank you all so much for joining us. We love having you here. Round Hill Radio is brought to you by the friends and members of Round Hill Community Church. For more information, please visit roundhillradio.org.